Hello, welcome to another lesson in IB history. Today we're going to continue with the Cold War. Our lesson for today is going to be on the politics of the Détente from 1963 to 1979. This presentation will cover the period of the Détente and coexistence between NATO and the Warsaw Pact from the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis to SALT II in 1979. Progress was made by the two superpowers towards controlling the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In Europe, through the development of the FRG's Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, and the FRG recognized the GDR and effectively accepted territorial changes made in Poland and Czechoslovakia at Germany's cost in 1945. The Helsinki Accords of 1973 seemed to open a new era of peaceful coexistence between the US and its NATO allies and the USSR and the Warsaw Pact, although conflict in Africa and the invasion of Afghanistan by the USSR demonstrated that the Détente was limited to Europe. The first section of this presentation is US-Soviet relations from 1963 to 72, and the guiding question is, to what extent did US-Soviet relations improve between this time period? Please take a screenshot of this slide because it's going to be how this part of the presentation is structured. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the US and the USSR were ready to consider negotiations on arms control and to cooperate more closely to prevent a conflict between them and their allies. In 1972, the leaders of both the US and the USSR, Nixon and Brezhnev, signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, at a Moscow summit. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, which threatened to escalate into a nuclear war between the US and USSR in 1962, Khrushchev indicated that he was willing to seek a broad understanding with the US for peaceful coexistence. On June 20, 1963, the US and USSR agreed to install a direct communications link between the leaders of both the US and the USSR. This would allow direct communication in times of crisis instead of relying on intermediaries. Although Kennedy made a belligerent speech against communism at a Berlin Wall to a massive crowd of West Berliners, the US signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty on August 5th, with the USSR and Britain. This treaty banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space, but allowed nuclear explosions to continue underground. The treaty was not signed by France and the People's Republic of China. They were determined to develop their own independent nuclear weapons. So let's check out the blast that they created in terms of the testing of these nuclear bombs. As you can see on the side of the US and Britain, the results are pretty dangerous. The same is going to happen with China and France later on. I'm going to scroll a little bit forward to see other results as well. With the assassination of Kennedy in November 1963 and Khrushchev's overthrow in October 1964, the Détente stalled. The new Soviet leadership, primarily Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny, was initially paralyzed by disagreements over defense and the economy. On the bottom, we're going to be seeing these leaders. We have Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982. We have Alexei Kosygin, Primer of the USSR from 1964 to the 80. And we have Nikolai Podgorny, Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, again from 1965 to 77. In June 1967, in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War, Kosygin attended the UN General Assembly discussions on the Middle East. US President Johnson met him for the talks at Glassboro, New Jersey, to discuss not only the Middle East and Vietnam, but also the whole question of nuclear arms control. The discussions were frank and amiable, but inconclusive. This is what we know as the Glassboro Summit. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by Britain, the US, and the USSR. They agreed to not to transfer nuclear weapons to other countries or to assist other states to manufacture them. In November 1969, they were joined by West Germany. Both France and the PRC signed only in 1993. That's the year I was born. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia is a key situation that we have to understand. This happened in August 1968 and briefly interrupted the progress towards a Soviet-US Détente. Secretly, both sides assured each other that the Czechoslovakian crisis represented only a temporary delay in the Détente negotiations. In November, talks on a strategic arms limitation, SALT I, began in Vienna, Austria, and Helsinki, Finland. When Richard Nixon became U.S. President in January 1969, his stated main objective was to withdraw U.S. forces from Vietnam. He hoped to make progress in the SALT talks, depending on Soviet willingness to put pressure on North Vietnam to end the war, but the USSR dismissed any linkage between the two. This is going to be developing into an ABM challenge. The US had been alarmed by both the Soviet development of anti-ballistic missiles, or ABMs, around Moscow from 1963 onwards, and the increase of anti-aircraft defenses. President Johnson feared that the effective development of the ABM system by the USSR would upset the nuclear balance of power between the US and the USSR, afforded by the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. So we're going to be seeing a disturbance in the balance of power because of the weapons that the USSR has. The US countered this by developing multiple independently target reentry vehicles, or MIRVs. These were missiles that carried up to 12 nuclear warheads, each being released in the upper atmosphere to attack a different target, making Soviet defenses less likely to succeed since they would have 12 targets instead of just a single missile with a single warhead. At Glassboro, Kosygin initially rejected such a ban on the grounds that the ABMs were defensive weapons and therefore could hardly trigger the outbreak of war. However, by the time the SALT talks began in November 1969, Soviet leaders agreed that the question of the ABM limitation should be included in the SALT talks, fearing that the US might develop a more effective ABM system to counter Soviet nuclear missiles. Therefore, we have the MIRVs as well. The crucial issue during these talks was the Soviet demand that the term strategic arms should cover all systems capable of launching any type of attacks on the USSR, both nuclear and conventional warheads. This would include all US missile launching sites in Europe and at sea. In the end, compromise was reached when the US made an agreement on limiting ABMs conditional on the USSR freezing the number of ICBMs at their existing level. On May 26, Nixon and Brezhnev signed both the ABM and SALT I treaties. The Treaty on the Limitations on Anti-Ballistic missile systems was created in May 26, 1972. This treaty allowed both countries to deploy 2 fixed ground-based defense sites of 100 missile interceptors each. One site was permitted to protect each national capital, while the second site could be deployed to protect an intercontinental ballistic missile field base. The SALT I Treaty included a 5-year freeze on the construction of missile launchers, a freeze on the construction of intercontinental and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. New submarine-launched ballistic missile launchers and modern ballistic submarines could only be constructed after the same number of older launchers had been dismantled. So very limited construction of arms altogether. Détente in Europe took place against the background of tension between the USSR and the People's Republic of China, while the US and the People's Republic of China had developed a rapprochement. Throughout the summer of 1969, relations between the USSR and PRC continued to deteriorate. On August 13, in a major clash in the Xinjiang province, a Chinese brigade of over 1,000 men was annihilated by Soviet troops. The PRC retaliated by declaring a general mobilization along the border with the USSR and Mongolia. US President Nixon made it clear to his cabinet that the US would not allow the PRC to be smashed in a war between the PRC and the Soviet Union, and so Nixon is going to be visiting China. In late 1969 and early 1970, friendly diplomatic contacts between the PRC and the US began for the first time. In May 1971, the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to the PRC in secrecy to make arrangements for a visit by Nixon to China. This took place in February 1972, with the US and Chinese governments declaring that neither the PRC nor the US would seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country, like the USSR, to establish such hegemony. The future of Taiwan would be settled peacefully. The US would end the patrols of its navy through the Taiwan Straits, on the understanding that the Chinese would not invade the island. This declaration was a major blow for the USSR. Nevertheless, the Soviets hoped to prevent an alliance between the US and the PRC by improving relations with the US. Ultimately, this is going to be leading to another Moscow Summit in 1972. Remember that we have multiple ones throughout the Cold War. This specific meeting was a success for both participants. The ABM and arms limitation treaties were signed. Brezhnev agreed to discuss with the North Vietnamese governments the latest U.S. proposals for peace in Vietnam. The U.S. agreed to allow the USSR to purchase grain and to expand bilateral trade, resulting in the Soviet-U.S. Trade Agreement of 1972, and both agreed to hold a conference on European security, which the USSR had long wanted. In order to understand the principles of Détente, we need to understand the basic principles of relations between the US and the USSR, an agreement that was included within the Moscow Summit. I'm going to be reading an excerpt of this basic principle relations charter so that you understand what Détente means. The United States and of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics have agreed as follows. First, differences in ideology and in the social systems of the USA and the USSR are not obstacles to the bilateral principles of sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, and mutual disadvantage. Second, the US and the USSR attach major importance to preventing the development of situations capable of causing a dangerous exacerbation of their relations. Therefore, they will do their utmost to avoid military confrontations and to prevent the outbreak of nuclear war. They will always exercise restraint in their mutual relations and will be prepared to negotiate and settle differences by peaceful means. Discussions and negotiations on outstanding issues will be conducted in a spirit of reciprocity, mutual accommodation, and mutual benefit. Fifth, the US and the USSR reaffirm their readiness to continue the practice of exchanging views of problems of mutual interest. Sixth, the parties will continue their efforts to limit armaments on a bilateral as well as on a multilateral basis. The US and the USSR regard as the ultimate objective their efforts, the achievement of general and complete disarmament and the establishment of an effective system of international security in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Seventh, the US and the USSR regard commercial and economic ties as an important and necessary element in strengthening their bilateral relations. Eighth, the two sides consider it timely and useful to develop mutual contact and cooperation in the fields of science and technology. So as you can see, they're actually working towards cooperation, full cooperation in all aspects of governance. They're going to be working in technology, they're going to be working in the economy, they're going to be working politically, and obviously this is to understand that nobody wants a nuclear war. We're going to have conflicting interpretations of Détente. The US and the USSR hope to achieve different results from the Moscow Summit, but the charter is what they got from it. They both supported Détente in the belief that it would be in their own interest at the end of the day. The USSR hoped to establish the arms race once it had achieved approximate parity in nuclear weapons with the US. The Soviets wanted to reduce expenditure on nuclear weapons and found it increasingly difficult to keep up with the US technologically strengthened Détente and Ostpolitik in Europe with the aim of gaining legal recognition from the US and NATO of the Eastern Germany and of Poland's and Czechoslovakia's post-1945 frontiers. They wanted East versus West trade, which would give Soviet and Eastern European economies access to Western technology and finance, and neutralize the threat of US-Chinese alliances, by giving the US and NATO states reasons to maintain good relations with the USSR. So they want to basically have access to the West without being intervened by any other country. The US, in its turn, hope to maintain, obviously, the status quo. They want to maintain their hegemony worldwide, but they also want this policy of Detente. And so what they're going to be doing is basically, again, maintaining the balance in terms of nuclear weapons. They're going to be attempting to recognize these countries, but in a way that they're going to be still proposing Western ideology within Eastern Germany and within both Czechoslovakia and Poland. And ultimately, they're going to be working towards a policy of Detente internationally. Now for our next section, Detente in Europe from 1963 to 1969. Our guiding question is, how successful were NATO and the Warsaw Pact in achieving Detente and coexistence in Europe over the period of 1963 to 1969? Please take a screenshot of this slide so that you can have this in your notes. This is how this section of the presentation is structured. The peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and the stabilizing effect of the Berlin Wall on the GVR laid the foundations for a new period of stability in both Eastern and Western Europe. First, we're going to be talking about Western Europe. In Western Europe, a number of factors combined to loosen the close links between the US and the leading NATO states forged in the early days of the Cold War. The economies of France and Western Germany and Italy were doing well and no longer needed US economic assistance. The Test-Ban Treaty of 1963 and the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty in 1968 were welcomed in Western Europe, but essentially they assumed a world divided into two blocs, led by the respected superpower. There were growing doubts, especially in France, and to a lesser extent in Western Germany, whether the US would risk a nuclear war to defend Western Europe from a Soviet attack. The US involvement in Vietnam was also criticized by Western European states, who rejected US President Johnson's argument that the war was vital to confront communism and prevent its adoption by other states. Despite the fact that the US had committed some 300,000 troops to protect Western Europe since 1947, no Western European state sent troops to Vietnam. By 1968, the Vietnam War was causing growing hostility to the US as a result of what appeared to be its ineffective but often ruthless military tactics, losing its position as a moral leader of the West. A wave of student protests swept the Western European universities aimed principally at US involvement in Vietnam. So at the end of the day, everybody wants peace, and it's going to be peace worldwide. French President de Gaulle took the lead in the attack on US influence in Western Europe. He now saw French participation in a US-dominated NATO as the main threat to French national independence. In January 1963, the US refused to share its nuclear technology with France, but by the Nassau Agreement of December 1962, agreed to supply Polaris missiles to the UK. In protest, de Gaulle vetoed Britain's application to join the European Economic Commission, the European Economic Commission, on the grounds that Britain was still too dependent on the US. De Gaulle also denounced the 1963 Test-Ban Treaty with the argument that France must be able to defend itself. He withdrew French forces from NATO and removed its headquarters from Paris, although he declared that France would still come to the help of any NATO member subject to unprovoked aggression. De Gaulle also had a very strict economic policy. He therefore worked to weaken the US dollar at a time when the US was starting to feel the financial pressure of the costs of the Vietnam War. Between 1965 and 1968, France converted a large number of paper dollars held in French banks at the internationally agreed rate of 3.5 per ounce into gold. By doing this, he diminished US gold reserves. De Gaulle aimed to achieve Detente with the Warsaw Pact by following two separate policies. The first one is improving relations with the USSR. establishing relations with individual members of the Warsaw Pact and encouraging them to imitate French national assertion by making themselves more independent of the USSR. Therefore, they're going to be establishing a French-Soviet hotline. De Gaulle was invited to visit the USSR in 1966, where after a tour he signed a joint declaration which provided for a permanent communications link between the French and Soviet governments and for a Franco-Soviet commission to expand Franco-Soviet contacts. In December, Kosygin visited France and together with de Gaulle called for a European conference to examine the problems of security and the possibilities of European cooperation. Ultimately, this prepared the way for the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1973. In the Federal Republic of Germany, we're going to be seeing the beginning of Ostpolitik. De Gaulle's determination to follow an independent policy towards the USSR and Warsaw Bloc countries, as well as the development of the Détente between US and USSR, created a new situation for East Germany. In 1965, for example, a visit to Middle East by Ulbricht, the German Democratic Republic leader, led to 10 states recognizing East Germany and ending relations with West Germany. Gradually, during the 1960s, Western Germany began to abandon the Hallstein Doctrine and reconsidered its policy towards the Western Germany and to Soviet bloc. A key figure in developing what became known as Ostpolitik was Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Major of West Berlin. As early as December 1963, he negotiated directly with East Berlin, and by agreeing to refer to it as the GDR capital, he secured for 8 days the right of West Berliners to visit their relatives in East Berlin. So tensions between both East and West Berlin are now diminishing. People around the world are starting to recognize East Berlin and East Germany as an entire country. And at the end of the day, West Germany is going to start recognizing its sister state. Ostpolitik began to take a more definite shape when the Grand Coalition between West Germany's two parties, SPD and CDU under Kurt Kaisenegger, was formed in December 1966, with Will Brandt as Foreign Secretary. The coalition established trade missions in Yugoslavia and Romania and made an agreement with Czechoslovakia whereby both countries could open consulates in each other's territory. At first, these initiatives were ignored. The GDR's leader, Walter Ulbricht, went out of his way to dismiss compromise and to argue that unity was only possible between two socialist Germanys. Obviously, NATO and Detente is going to be an issue within Europe as well. France's departure from NATO's military organization and growing divisions between the US and Western Europe threatened the unity of NATO. Given the economic prosperity of Western European states, the refusal to assist the US in Vietnam, and the hostility of de Gaulle in France, there were increasing demands in the US that NATO states should be prepared to assume a greater role in the defense of Western Europe. To President Johnson, two apparently contradictory positions could be reconciled with each other. In Vietnam, he argued that the US was fighting to show that aggression should not succeed, while in Europe it was seeking to create a climate of cooperation and detente, which would eliminate the threat of nuclear war. France's withdrawal from NATO's military organization threw it into turmoil. NATO's headquarters was moved to Brussels and all NATO troops had to leave France. There were fears that unless NATO adjusted its aims and organization to take account of the new mood of the Détente, it might break up in 1969, when the original treaty of 1949 came up for renewal. In December 1966, Belgium's Foreign Minister Pierre Harmel proposed that NATO should reconsider both its military and political role in Europe. In December 1969, Harmel and NATO officials produced a report that stated that NATO's role was not only to defend Western Europe, but also to reach a Détente with Warsaw Pact states. The Harmel report redefined NATO's role in the age of Détente and prevented the political tensions resulting from the Vietnam War from destroying the NATO alliance. There's also going to be growing divisions between the countries in the Warsaw Pact. The atmosphere of the Détente and the Sino-Soviet split all combined to weaken Soviet control over Eastern Europe and provide some opportunities for these states to pursue independent policies. We're going to be looking at each state independently. Albania's leader, Enver Hoxha, drew closer to China for a number of reasons. He rejected Comecon, plans for the integration of the Albanian economy into the Soviet bloc, opposed the improvement in relations between Yugoslavia and the USSR, was hostile to USSR's policy of Détente with the US, increasingly saw Maoism as a model for Albania, and launched his own cultural revolution in 1967. He also withdrew Albania from the Warsaw Pact after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. By successfully disobeying the USSR and effectively freeing itself from the Soviet bloc, Albania created a precedent for the other states to follow. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu also used the Sino-Soviet split to strengthen Romania's own version of communism. It was generally in the Soviet model, but also nationalist and asserted Romania's economic, political, and cultural independence from the USSR. Again, we're looking at this post-Stalinist regime, de-Stalinization. Although it did not leave the Warsaw Pact, in 1964, Romania did not allow the pact to hold maneuvers in its country, and in 1968 did not participate in the invasion of Czechoslovakia. In Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov, communist leader, remained a close ally of the USSR. He survived the fall of Khrushchev and strengthened his position at home by purging his opponents. He supported Brezhnev's policy of Détente and frequently acted as a diplomatic channel for contacts between USSR and NATO. In Poland, in October 1956, Gomulka saved Poland from Soviet intervention by assuring Khrushchev that he would take measures to protect Polish communism. In effect, Gomulka had managed to achieve a special status for Poland. Its agriculture, in contrast to the rest of the Soviet bloc, was not collectivized. It received aid from the US for the purchase of grain, and its volume of trade with the West was the highest in the Warsaw Pact. This was tolerated by the USSR as a price for maintaining communism in Poland. After the suppression of the revolt in Hungary in November 1956, the Hungarian government under János Kadar made no attempt to distance itself from the USSR. It followed Soviet directives on foreign policy and Détente and was a loyal member of the Warsaw Pact. Kadar did, however, follow an independent economic policy in an attempt to win support for his regime by establishing the new economic mechanism in 1968. This abandoned central planning and encouraged enterprises to make their own economic decisions. In Czechoslovakia, we're going to have the rise of the Prague Spring. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček became the first secretary of the Czech Communist Party. Like Nagy in Hungary in 1956, he attempted to create a socialist system that would be based on the consent of the people, rather than forced on them by the USSR, as had been the case in Eastern Europe since the late 1940s. In April 1968, he unveiled his program for democratic change and modernization of the economy, which marked the start of what was called the Prague Spring. In April, the Czech Communist Party announced a program for a new profoundly democratic model of Czechoslovak socialism, conforming Czechoslovak conditions. Like Gorbachev later in the USSR, Dubček wanted to preserve socialism, but increasingly public opinion began to press for the creation of a democracy based on the Western model. In June, he abolished censorship, leading to a flood of anti-Soviet propaganda being published. Although Dubček reluctantly agreed to restore censorship, Brezhnev had no confidence that he would succeed, and during the 9th of August 20th to the 21st, 20 divisions of Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia. Dubček would have to cancel all Prague Spring reforms. So again, the Prague Spring is going to be completely taken over by a full-on scale invasion, which is what we call the Czechoslovakian invasion. And later on, we're going to be seeing Czechoslovakia freeing themselves from the USSR as well. In 1969, Dubček resigned and was replaced by Gustav Husak. In November, Brezhnev defended the invasion by again stressing that any threat to socialism in a Warsaw Pact country was also a threat to its allies. This became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now we're going to move on to section 3 of this presentation, Ostpolitik. We're going to look at how did the Ostpolitik contribute towards Detente in Europe. Again, please take a screenshot of this slide, have it in your notes. This is how this part of the presentation is structured. The invasion of Czechoslovakia was, as Foreign Prime Minister Michel Debré stated, a traffic incident on the road to Detente. It slowed down but did not halt progress. The election of Richard Nixon to the US presidency in November 1968 and of Willy Brandt to the West German chancellorship in October 1969 with a mandate for his Ostpolitik policy was soon to give its fresh impetus. By recognizing the GDR as a legal state and accepting the post-1945 Polish and Czechoslovakian frontiers, the Western Germany accepted political reality. At the same time, by improving relations between the two Germanys, Brandt hoped to begin a political process that would gradually end the reunification of Germany. He reassured the US and his NATO allies that the FRG did not intend to withdraw from NATO or the European community, thus gaining their support. By 1970 and 1972, Brandt negotiated a complex set of interlocking treaties, marking a major turning point in the Cold War. These were between the FRG and the Soviet Union. This is known as the Moscow Treaty of 1970. The FRG and Poland, the Warsaw Treaty of 1970. Britain, France, the US, and the USSR, the Four-Power Treaty on Berlin in 1971. The FRG and the GDR, or the Basic Treaty between the two Germanys in 1972, and the FRG and Czechoslovakia, the Prague Treaty of 1973. The FRG signature of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1969, its readiness to increase technological and economic links with the USSR, and willingness to agree to a European Security Conference, which the Soviets hoped would confirm its post-war control of Eastern Europe, were all preliminary concessions that helped pave the way for a treaty with the USSR. After prolonged negotiations, the foundation stone of Ostpolitik, as historian A.J. Nichols calls the Moscow Treaty, was signed on August 12, 1970 by Brandt and Brezhnev. In this, the USSR and Western Germany declared that they had no territorial claims against any other state. The FRG recognized the non-violability of both Poland's western frontier and the inner German frontier. In a second part of the treaty, the FRG committed itself to negotiating treaties with Poland, the GDR, and Czechoslovakia. The FRG agreed to abandon the Helsinki Doctrine and accept that both Germanys would eventually become members of the United Nations. So again, it's extremely important to recognize the Moscow Treaty of 1970 as a way to pave the way for a reunified Germany altogether. This is basically an example of the policy of the Detente that is being held in place by all these different states that are participating internationally. Because of this new sense of German unity, we're going to have a letter that is going to be proclaiming this. The FRG also presented Brezhnev with a letter on German unity. This stressed the FRG's right to work towards a state of peace in Europe in which the German peoples regains its unity in free self-determination. So again, self-determination is going to be a key concept in international relations, and we have to understand that each state, in terms of foreign sovereignty and the United Nations, has this right to self-determination. This was implemented in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Negotiations with Poland ran parallel with the Moscow talks and were completed in December 1970. Both Poland and the FRG recognized that they had no territorial demands on each other and that the other Nisi line was inviolable. In June 1973, the Prague Treaty was initialized with Czechoslovakia, but not finally ratified by the FRG's parliament until 1974. It revoked the Munich Treaty of 1938, which had awarded the Sudetenland to Germany, acknowledged the inviolability of the Czechoslovakian common borders and renounced all territorial claims. It also allowed the immigration of any Czechoslovaks to the FRG who had German citizenship. About 10,000 people left Czechoslovakia to go back to Germany. So again, these are all the border disputes that had been happenings before World War II, and even after World War II, we're seeing these border disputes finally ending with these treaties in the 1970s. We're also going to have, obviously, the four-power negotiations over Berlin. In March 1970, these four-power discussions began on the difficult problem of access to West Berlin. The NATO allies wanted a settlement underwritten by the USSR that would finally confirm West Berlin's political links with the FRG and guarantee its freedom of access through the GDR to the FRG. The Four-Power Treaty on Berlin, signed on September 1971, was a milestone in the history of divided Berlin and divided Germany. Now there's freedom of access between East Berlin and West Berlin. Obviously, the Soviets are going to have to make some concessions. The Soviets conceded three vital principles. First, unimpeded traffic between West Berlin and the FRG. The second, recognition of West Berlin ties with the FRG. And the third, the right of West Berliners to visit East Berlin. In return, Britain, France, and the US agreed that the western sectors of Berlin were not legally part of FRG, even if in practice they had been since West Berlin adopted the FRG's constitution in 1950. We're therefore going to have multiple negotiations between both East and West Germany. For the GDR, an agreement with the FRG was not without risk. If successful, it would undoubtedly secure the state international recognition, but risk closer contact with the magnetic social and economic forces of the West. Brandt was aiming ultimately at the social democratization of the GDR, or in other words, gradually through contacts and cooperation, turning the GDR into a social democratic country similar to the FRG. Brezhnev warned it must not come to a process of rapprochement between the FRG and the GDR. Concentrate everything on all-sided strengthening of the GDR, as he called it. Initially, a series of technological agreements on transit traffic, the rights of West Berliners to visit East Berlin, and on postal communications were concluded. Slowly but surely, both Germanys are becoming one. Now, we also have the Basic Treaty, which is really important here. The two states then moved on to negotiate the more crucial Basic Treaty in 1972. In it, the FRG recognized the GDR as an equal and sovereign state and also accepted that both states should be represented at the United Nations. The FRG did, however, stress that it still considered the people of the GDR to have a common German citizenship. And in a letter concerning German unity, which I have presented before, it repeated its determination to work peacefully for German reunification. The two German states joined the United Nations in 1973. So it's really, really important to consider that both Germanys recognize that they're German. Both Germanys want this reunification, but they want it in different ways. The West Germany wants a more social democratic regime. East Germany wants to maintain this communist regime. Obviously, the East Germany's government wants to maintain this turmoil and this unity because that's how they're going to be remaining an independent country, while the West actually wants to implement more Western policies in order to free the people of East Berlin and free the people of East Germany. Now, finally, we're going to be moving on to the fourth section of this presentation, the Helsinki Accords and SALT II. This is on 1975 to 1979. The guiding question is, to what extent could the Helsinki Accords be regarded as the final peace settlement of the First World War in Europe? So remember that the Cold War and the Second World War kind of merged together because we're seeing a period of conflict across the 20th century, and we have to understand that this is going to be one of the last peace settlements that we see based on the conflicts of the First World War. Again, please take a screenshot of this slide, so because this is how this section of the presentation is structured, have this in your notes. In July 1973, the Conference on Security and Cooperation began in Helsinki, Finland. The USSR wanted to persuade the West to recognize as permanent the territorial and political division of Europe made at Yalta, while increasing economic, scientific, and technological cooperation among them. The US initially consented to the conference in return for a Soviet agreement on Berlin and the opening of negotiations in Vienna, Austria, on mutual reductions of troops and armaments in Central Europe. Detailed negotiations concluded with a summit consisting of the leaders of 35 countries in Helsinki in July and August 1975. The subsequent Helsinki Accords marked the high point of the Détente and was signed on August 1, 1975 by 33 European states, Canada, and the United States. Concessions were made to discuss human rights, free movement, and re-establishing the spheres of influence in Europe. We're going to have specific terms of the Helsinki Accords. The Accords were divided into 3 sections, or baskets as they were called. Basket 1 dealt with European security and established guiding principles for interstate relationships. The principles included the settlement of disputes, non-interference in internal affairs of other states, and the inviolability of frontiers. Brezhnev had hope initially that he would be able to negotiate a peace treaty permanently guaranteeing the new post-war frontiers, but under West German pressure, US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger managed to persuade the Soviets to accept the eventual possibility of a peaceful change to frontiers. Basket 2 concerned promoting cooperation in economic, science, technology, and environmental issues. Basket 3 called for cooperation in humanitarian and other fields. This meant expanding trade, tourism, and cultural contacts between the two blocs, as well as promoting the reunion of families split by the Iron Curtain. Now, finally, we're going to be talking about the SALT II Agreement. In 1973, talks began in Vienna to explore the potential of reducing military forces and armaments in Europe. The talks aimed to create stability in Central Europe by negotiating a mutually balanced program of arms reduction. The hope for securing military stability between NATO and the Warsaw Pact came to focus on reductions in nuclear rather than conventional weapons. We're going to start with the Vladivostok Summit of November 1974. Nixon's successor, President Gerald Ford, did manage to make progress at the Vladivostok Summit in 1974. He and Brezhnev agreed that by 1985, the two countries would reach a state of numerical equality in the deployment of missile launchers and bombers. Initially, the new US President Jimmy Carter demanded far greater mutual arms reduction. The Soviet Union rejected this outright, but by February 1977, the numerical limits proposed by both sides were close to those ultimately agreed upon. Issues with monitoring and tensions in the international spheres were deterrents in signing any agreements until 1979. Basically, every president wants to end the Cold War. The key terms of the SALT II agreements were a limit of 2,400 warheads was placed on the overall numbers of strategic missiles and bombers each side could possess. Of this, 1,320 missiles could have multiple warhead negotiations for further significant and substantial reductions were to take place. Many senators, as well as the US military, were highly critical of SALT II. In January 1980, President Carter decided not to submit it to the Senate in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We're going to be seeing this Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and how the Cold War ends in the next video. Thank you so much for listening. I want to thank David Williamson for his book on the Cold War, and we recognize all the authors of all visual and auditory content in this presentation. Thank you for listening.